One more day in heaven. I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. Deuteronomy 30:19, King James Version. Hot Apple Pie was shooting up the charts when we got the news that Scott Borchetta was leaving the label. I was devastated. Deep down I knew that it was the beginning of the end for the label and the band. Scott was the best of the best. He was the big reason that DreamWorks was having the success that they were having at country radio. There was no one that could replace him. He left and took Toby Keith with him, DreamWorks' top-selling artist. Hot Apple Pie had barely built up steam when the bottom fell out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Richard, along with James Stroud, tried to reassure me that everything would be all right, but I knew it wouldn't be. The talk in Nashville was not Hot Apple Pie. It was Scott Borchetta leaving to start up a company called Big Machine Records. Their first artist to be signed was a new female artist named Taylor Swift. Just as I predicted, our single fell off the charts within the next couple of weeks. We tried to release another song called We're Making Up, and it peaked at 54 on the charts. We even tried for a third time with Easy Does It, and it pretty much did the same thing. The band was in a bad place. We started second-guessing every move we made. We even got to the point of firing Sparky because we felt he was unhappy with how we paid him. It seemed that Sparky had grown tired of the band and seemed overly concerned about how much money he was making. Looking back now, I can't blame him. He had every right to be worried. The band and everything around us was falling down like Jenga blocks. We tried replacing Sparky with Kevin Ray for a while, but it just wasn't the same. Kevin was a gifted guitarist and could sing really well, but the chemistry wasn't exactly right. We also gave Brian Nutter a shot. Same thing, incredible player, but just didn't have the same mojo as Sparky did. Everyone was so frustrated when DreamWorks announced that they were going to close up shop. James told us they were going to merge with Universal so we'd still have a record deal. For a moment we thought maybe the new label would save us. Maybe they'd get us where we wanted to go. After meeting with the head of the label, Luke Lewis, I knew it was only a matter of time before he'd drop us too. He didn't understand the music at all. He responded to me in a meeting one time with, "Quit trying to reinvent the wheel. This is the music business." I knew right then we weren't on the same page. Despite how I felt about everything, we started making a new record. I had written a few songs for it, but no one seemed to like the songs I turned in that much. Richard was at the helm, and he wanted us to be more commercial. I tried my very best to stay focused, but it felt like it was all a big waste of time. Our new label didn't seem that interested in what we were doing, even though they said they were. We got Tom Bukovac and Brent Mason to come in and record with us to fill Sparky's shoes. Again, both of those guys are as pro as they come, but it just wasn't the same. After finishing up the record, I felt numb. I didn't like it. I felt alone, too. Richard, Keith, and Trey seemed to dig it, but I felt it wasn't unique enough. Yes, there were cool moments and some good songs, but it didn't sound like Hot Apple Pie. It sounded like another Nashville record. Not long after we turned in the record, the label dropped us. They said they had some other priorities they had to concentrate on and wished us luck. I was tired. I was sick of trying to please everyone else. I had started the HAP project because I felt we could make a difference and put out some new music that would impact people. Unfortunately, that didn't happen the way I wanted it to. While I had been dealing with the HAP drama, Lisa and I had started the Franklin Bridal Ball. It was mostly Lisa, though. I did whatever I could and helped fund it. She teamed up with two other talented business women to put on an event where we'd rent out several large rooms in a place called the Factory at Franklin. We then rented 10 by 10 booths to local wedding vendors so they could show off their wares to those getting married. It was quite an ordeal. There was a fashion show, giveaways, food tastings, and even limousines parked outside for couples to consider for their big day. Caterers, tent rental companies, bridal gown shops, and anything else that went along with having a wedding were there. Lisa stayed very busy throughout the year getting ready for it. I remember getting a call from Mom one day, and she sounded upset. I could tell something was wrong immediately. She said, "Well, honey, you doing okay?" I said, "What's wrong, Mom?" She continued, "Honey, I didn't know whether or not to call you, but your dad's in the hospital." She told me that he had been at McDonald's that morning for a sausage biscuit, then came home. Not long after that, she said he'd been over in extreme pain and told her to call 911. Everything she said after that was fuzzy. I told her I'd come home immediately. I called Lisa to tell her what had happened and told her to get her things together because we needed to head to Fairfield. At the time, we had a little Mini Cooper car, and we threw our bags in as fast as we could and headed north. I sped the whole way. Normally, it would take me 5.5 hours to get home. This time, I was in Cincinnati in 4.5. I would have made even better time if I hadn't been pulled over by a cop in Covington, Kentucky. He clocked me going over 100 miles per hour. I told him the situation, but he had no sympathy whatsoever. In fact, I'm pretty sure he moved extra slow in writing me a $250 ticket. I was so mad, but I continued on and drove straight to the Mercy Hospital in Fairfield. Mom had called me and said he was in ICU. She told me that the doctor said it was pancreatitis. Evidently, Dad had a gallbladder stone that was blocking his bile duct. It was a very painful but manageable condition. I was thankful but still very worried. I met Mom at the hospital and we went in to see him. They had him pretty drugged up, but he was coherent. He was happy to see me and smiled when I walked in. He told me he had been in a lot of pain, but it got a little better once they gave him some pain medicine. Mom asked me on the way to the hospital if she should call his other kids and let them know his condition. I didn't hesitate and said absolutely, they need to know. We hadn't been at the hospital very long before my brothers Terry and Dinky arrived from Kentucky. They drove up together to check on Dad. As soon as they arrived, we all went in to see him. He was so thrilled to have us there. In fact, I remember him saying that evening, "This is the happiest day of my life to have all my boys in the same room together." I spent a little bit more time with him that night, and he told me that he loved me. He was doing pretty good, and he said he thought he'd be fine. The doctors and nurses said it would be okay for us to go home and get some sleep that night. They were going to give Dad some antibiotics and possibly operate in the next day or so. We said our goodbyes and headed to Mom and Dad's house. It was late in the night when we got a call from the hospital saying that Dad was not doing well and that we should come back to the hospital immediately. We didn't understand what was happening, but we rushed back to check on him. When we got there, the staff told us that he coded during the night. They explained that coded meant that Dad had a cardiopulmonary arrest. Basically, he died and they had to resuscitate him. I was in shock, and so was everyone else. We had no idea this situation was as bad as it was. When we left, Dad was okay and resting well. The doctors had it all under control. To this day, I'm not sure what happened. No matter how many questions I asked, the staff were vague about why he stopped breathing during the night. Maybe it was too much medication. Maybe the nurses weren't checking on him. Who knows? The issue now was that he wasn't responding. He was breathing, but he was in a coma. I talked to him, but he never reacted at all. Of course, we called all the family to let them know what happened. Everyone was just as surprised as we were. Even though pancreatitis is a serious situation, it was normally a fixable one. Not very many people die from it. As long as a person gets proper care, they go on to live normal lives. For the next 2 weeks, we waited. We cried, we prayed. I remember going to the restroom one day and crying harder than I ever have. It felt like I had been stabbed in the heart. I was so distraught. I prayed earnestly for God to heal him and make everything okay again. During that time, I tried to do some bargaining with God. When I would pray, I'd tell God if he healed Dad that I would do his work and be a better Christian. I even thought about making a Christian record and going down that path. I knew that Dad's only hope was God. Family and friends were flowing in and out of the hospital every day. Dad had so many friends that cared about him. Mom was a wreck in the waiting room. She wandered around from person to person, thanking them for coming. She had a far-off look in her eye, and I was constantly making sure she was okay. I was scared for her. How was she going to live here in Ohio without Dad if something happened to him? Would I need to move her down to Tennessee? It was all too much at times. One night in bed, Lisa and I were having a serious conversation about things, and out of the blue, I brought up having a child. Up until that point, I was on the fence about it, but after seeing Dad and the condition he was in, I wanted a family of my own. I wanted to be able to carry on the SEAL's name. That's when Lisa and I decided to have a baby. The next day, Mom said she'd like to go out and look for a black dress in case something happened to Dad. It broke my heart, but I knew deep down that she just might need one. Mom and Lisa wanted to go into a ladies' clothing store, and I said I was going to go check out a bookstore across the street. I was getting ready to go into the bookstore when an African American guy poked me on the shoulder and said, "Can I pray for you?" I almost teared up right then and there and said, "Yes, you can." He said a nice, thoughtful prayer, and he asked the Lord out loud to comfort me. When he was done, he said, "Do you mind if we go inside and talk for a moment?" Of course I agreed, and we walked in and sat down at a table. He asked me if everything was all right with me, and then I told him about Dad. The concern in his eyes and gentle nature was comforting. I opened up to him that I had been praying nonstop for a week for Dad to be healed. He asked if we could pray again, and I agreed. I couldn't help it. I cried listening to his words. When he finished, I thanked him and we exchanged numbers. He said to call him any time. He also said, "I have something else I want to talk to you about soon." He urged me to call him and we could talk about it the next time we met. He even said, "I feel God is telling me to tell you he has something special planned for you." It sparked my interest, and I told him that I would call and we'd meet up soon. When I left, I met back up with Mom and Lisa. I told them all about my encounter. They were both as amazed as I was. We all wondered what the something special meant. I told him that it felt like God sent an angel that day to pray for me. For the first time in a week, I felt hopeful that Dad just might survive this ordeal. When I returned to the hospital, Dad was worse. The doctor wanted to have a meeting with me. He said they had done an EEG and it wasn't good. An EEG is a monitoring method to record the electrical activity in Dad's brain. They basically said he was brain dead and there was no reason to continue his breathing and feeding tubes. I was faced with the task of telling Mom that Dad was going to die. I don't know how, but I kept it together enough to tell her the news. She took it as well as she could, and we wept. After talking with my brothers and sister, and Dad's brother and sisters, I gave the doctors permission to pull his life support. It was the hardest decision I ever made. I was a nervous wreck. All of my anxieties and depression came rolling back. I felt a void that I had never felt before. I couldn't see past the minute. The only thing I held on to was Mom, Lisa, and God. In fact, I called that stranger up that I met at the bookstore. I told him Dad's prognosis. He prayed again for me over the phone and asked if I'd meet up for a cup of coffee the next day. We agreed to meet at the same place again. When I got there, I felt completely out of it. I hadn't slept well and I was losing weight because of the stress. We sat down and he pulled a folder from his backpack. He told me that God had told him that I needed a new direction in my life that would help me get over the grief. He proceeded to give me a pitch to be a salesman for Amway. To say that I was disappointed would be the understatement of my lifetime. I was so incredibly mad that I didn't even know how to react. I just kindly said, "I need to go," and got up and walked out. I didn't wait for his response. I didn't have any second thoughts. I just left the store and walked to my car. The angel that I thought I'd been talking to turned out to be the devil. I looked straight into his eyes. To think he'd mess with my emotions and make a sales pitch during the death of my father was unfathomable. I had just been the victim of the worst kind of manipulation. I tried my best to put it behind me. I had more pressing issues to deal with. I had to prepare for Dad's funeral and all of the other things that came along with someone leaving this world. I needed to make sure Mom was not going to break down. She didn't know what she was going to do, and I didn't either. We were all lost without Dad. For about a week or so, we were in and out of the hospital. There were several family members there every day. It was horrible to sit and watch my father basically starve to death. His heart was still beating, but his mind had checked out. His body was slowly fading away. On the day he died, I had just left his room to go back home to get Mom and Lisa. Mom had told me to go through his bedroom drawer to see if there's anything that I'd like to have. His wallet was there, his wristwatches, his pocket knives, little trinkets that he had kept over the years. It was Scott Borchetta leaving to a little boy in the first credit card sleeve. I cried. That's when I heard the phone ring. Mom came into the room and said, "We need to go to the hospital." I knew without her saying another word that he was gone. I went to visit him one last time in his hospital room. When I got there, my sister Debbie was sitting there. When I looked at Dad, he didn't look like himself. His mouth was open and his face looked like a skeleton. The thing I noticed most, though, was his spirit was gone. I could no longer feel his presence in the room. I knew at that very moment that God and heaven was absolutely real. We buried Dad at Rose Hill Cemetery in Hamilton, Ohio, July 25th, 2007. He was 79, only a month or so before his 80th birthday. The family couldn't believe how many people came to his funeral and burial. It was standing room only. The man was so loved and will be missed by many. I stayed for another couple weeks with Mom. Lisa went back and forth once or twice during that time to tend to the bridal ball. I tried to help Mom wrap up loose ends with Dad's paperwork. I helped her around the house to fix a few things and just tried to be there for her. Lisa and I let Mom know she could come home with us for a while. She took us up on our offer and she came with us. She had a friend take her back to Ohio several weeks later. We discussed her moving down to Franklin, but she didn't want to leave her friends and family in Fairfield. She said her sister Tootie wouldn't know what to do with herself if she did that. Mom assured me she was going to be okay. I didn't pick up an instrument the whole time Dad was sick. I didn't have the desire. In fact, I got a call one day from a lady while dealing with Dad's arrangements. She was the casting director for a show called The $1 Million Quartet. It was a musical show based upon the 1956 Sun Records Studios impromptu jam session of Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. She asked if I'd be interested in playing the part of the killer. I kindly had to tell her no. My head was just too foggy to even consider it. I did, however, write a song with my friend and co-writer Tommy Barnes about a month after Dad had passed. It was called One More Day in Heaven. One more day in heaven. One day we're born, one day we die. People will mourn and people will cry, and people will miss them to have and to hold. But he is the master, and he's got a plan. Now don't you worry, we're all in good hands. But when you love somebody, it's still hard to let go. But one less day on earth is one more day in heaven. They're dancing with the angels on a gold and distant shore. You can think of it as a curse, but I look at it as a blessing. One less day on earth is one more day in heaven. When my father left, I was there by his side. He didn't say it, but I could see in his eyes. He felt comfort in knowing that he wasn't alone. There was somebody with him to show him the way through the valley of darkness to an uncloudy day, to where he's been living, to where he belongs. One less day on earth is one more day in heaven. He's dancing with the angels on a gold and distant shore. You can think of it as a curse, but I look at it as a blessing. One less day on earth is one more day in heaven. You can think of it as a curse, but I look at it as a blessing. Yeah, one less day on earth is one more day in heaven. I grieved hard after my dad passed. I didn't want the world to keep spinning, for everyone to just go on with their lives like it never happened. I went back into a deep depression, and I was angry at God. I felt he had let me down. He had a great opportunity to heal my dad and send me down a musical path that would be focused on Christian music. I know now that was selfish and egotistical on my part, but it's how I felt at the time. By the winter of '07, I wasn't feeling good at all. I was back to being anxious and depressed, and I knew I needed medication. I knew if I didn't head it off at the pass that I would sink even lower, And to add to my issues, I was starting to have trouble with my prostate. At first, I just thought I was getting up a lot at night to go to the restroom, but it started to disrupt my sleep. After a while, it was happening during the daytime as well. Something was wrong. I could feel something deep in my body wasn't right. Sometimes it would hurt to urinate. I went to visit a urologist, and he diagnosed me with an enlarged prostate. He said that I might have a condition called acute prostatitis. I couldn't quite believe what I was hearing. There's no way my luck could be that bad. I just lost my father, and now I had some sort of long-term medical condition. The doctor put me on some medication, but I was still having issues. In fact, one day I remember my groin was hurting unusually bad. When I felt down there, I discovered a little lump that I had never felt before. I immediately thought I had prostate cancer. I had a full-out breakdown. Lisa was in a meeting with her girlfriends that day at the house. So when I had the breakdown, I was alone in the bathroom. I certainly didn't want to come out weeping and complaining about my scrotum hurting and saying that I had cancer. I spent an hour or so thinking the worst and mentally trying to prepare myself for the official diagnosis. I called the doctor's office and made an emergency appointment. When I was finally able to see him, he informed me that it was only a swollen blood vessel. It was nothing to worry about, and the doctor sent me on my way. I came out of the doctor's office with a new lease on life. I still had a prostate issue, but at least I didn't have cancer. Several months later, Lisa told me she was pregnant. At the time, I was on medication for my prostate and had read that while on the drug, it was next to impossible to be fertile. But I was. God really wanted us to have a child. It went from the saddest time of my life to the happiest time of my life within a matter of months. I was going to be a dad. The thought was exciting and terrifying. I had so many emotions going on at the same time, it was hard to concentrate. Overall, I was happy even though I was sad that our child would never be able to meet their granddad. He or she would never spend time with him and hear all of his tall tales. Never barter with God. God is omniscient. He knew that I was going to have a baby before Dad got sick. He knew that my dark days would eventually turn to light. He knew my baby's name before I did. It says in the Bible in Jeremiah 1:5, King James Version, "Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. And before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee. And I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations." I know he knew. I also know that if it hadn't have been for Dad's death, my child would have most likely never been born. The other thing to take away from this chapter is never barter with God. He doesn't lack or need anything. God's very own existence comes from himself. So he is not dependent on anyone or anything else. We're dependent on him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist. Colossians 1:17, King James Version. God needs nothing. God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands, neither is worshipped with men's hands, as though he needed anything, seeing he giveth to all life and breath and all things. Acts 17:24 and 25, King James Version. I was desperate and selfish when Dad died. I wanted to keep my father on this earth longer than God intended. Simple as that. I didn't want to believe at the time that my dad wasn't made for this earth. His real home is in heaven. I was going to miss him. I was scared that I couldn't live life without him. But God showed me the hard way that I could. He knew best.